Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bill Treanor, the Dean of Georgetown Law, and it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce our keynote speaker today, Professor Philippe Sands. Before I introduce Professor Sands, I wanted to take a moment to honor the legacy of our event's namesake, especially for those of you who are just joining us. This conference is convened in the memory of a beloved member of Georgetown Law's community, Professor Sam Dash. As you may have heard this morning, Sam Dash was committed to promoting and protecting human rights around the world. This included leading a mission to Northern Ireland to investigate the 1972 Bloody Sunday incident and working towards the mediation efforts that led to the release of Nelson Mandela, among many other notable accomplishments. Sam embodied the Law Center's mission, law is but the means, justice is the end. That commitment has a long history at Georgetown and lives on through the work of our students, faculty, and staff. And that's why it brings me such great pleasure to welcome Professor Sands with us today, as he too embodies this mission. Professor Sands is a professor of law at University College London, a barrister at Matrix Chambers, and the author of numerous books, including Lawless World, East-West Street, and The Ratline. He's had a distinguished career as an international lawyer, working on numerous cases in the field of environment and natural resources, international trade, as well as maritime boundary disputes and disputes concerning the law of the sea, including representing the Philippines in the South China Sea arbitration. But it is his work on issues pertaining to justice and accountability for violations of international human rights law and international criminal law that is the reason why we are so honored to welcome Professor Sands here today as our keynote speaker for this year's Dash Conference on Justice and Accountability for Atrocity Crimes. Professor Sands has been instrumental in shaping modern international criminal law, having worked on the negotiation of the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court. He's also played a role in landmark cases seeking to bring perpetrators to justice, including through his work on the Pinochet case and pursuing accountability for atrocity crimes in the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and Iraq, among other places. He is currently serving as counsel to the Gambia in a case brought against Myanmar before the International Court of Justice for the crimes committed against the Rohingya. As an author, Professor Sands has a particular talent in humanizing some of the most pivotal moments in the history of international law through narrative storytelling. It is a talent and a writing style that his friend, the late John le Carré, described appropriately as hypnotic. He's made these stories accessible through podcasts and a documentary film, pushing his readers, listeners, and viewers to confront some of the most challenging moral and ethical dilemmas, such as how to reconcile the humanity of perpetrators with the horrendous crimes they committed, and how their descendants grapple with the legacy of those atrocities. Through his work, Professor Sands serves as a model for our students, demonstrating that the pursuit of justice is multidimensional and that the career of a lawyer need not be confined to the courtroom. It exists in skilled negotiation, in passionate advocacy, and through bridging the gap between the law and our common understanding. It is an honor and a privilege to welcome here today. Please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Professor Philippe Sands. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Dean Treanor, and thank you also, Melissa. It's a real happiness to be back at Georgetown and the Human Rights Institute, and to be part of this extraordinary program for the Dash conference honoring Sam Dash. I'm going to address the subject of justice and accountability for atrocity crimes in a broader context, and it's one that I've been immersed in for nearly a decade. I think it could be said that on modern international justice, all roads lead to Nuremberg. Without that famous trial, we wouldn't have had the Yugoslavian Rwanda tribunals, or the International Criminal Court, or the Pinochet case in London, or the Convention Against Genocide, or the recent case mentioned by Dean Treanor, brought to the International Court by the Gambia against Myanmar, alleging genocide against the Rohingya community. Interestingly, in the course of that hearing, the head of the delegation of Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi, used a formulation that I thought was interesting. She said to the court, "International law may well be our only global value system, and international justice a practice that affirms our common values." I agreed with her on that part of her statement, but sitting just a few feet from me for 4 days, not much else she had to say, it must be said. Every one of these cases and the other ones that you're talking about in this important conference also involve personal stories. And that's the connection that I want to explore between the minutiae of the personal and the broader political and intellectual legal domain of these trials. That's what's become of particular interest to me. And that brings me to the two books Dean so generously referred to, East-West Street and the Ratline, which are part of a broader project. In writing those books, I came to know the sons of two perpetrators, Nicholas Frank and Horst Wächter, the sons of two leading Nazis who were directly involved in the extermination of my grandfather's family. And those meetings and those contacts and the information that I learned from them all came about unexpectedly. I wasn't looking for personal stories. In the 1960s, my brother and I would often visit our grandparents in Paris near the Gare du Nord. And as children, we came to understand the past was painful and that we should not ask too many questions or any questions. The apartment of my grandparents was a place of silences, one that seemed to be haunted by secrets. But I only really started to think about those silences and those secrets when I was in my 50s, in my 50th year, actually, when I was invited to deliver a lecture in a city in Ukraine called Lviv. The law faculty invited me to give a talk about the cases I had been involved in on crimes against humanity and genocide. I went to Lviv, and one thing led to another. Melissa, perhaps you could put up the first slide. I went looking for the house where my grandfather was born. His name was Leon Buchholz, and he was born in the city of Lviv in 1904 when it was called Lemberg. I learned of the terrible events that occurred there, unleashed by the words of Hans Frank, who had been Governor General of Nazi-occupied Poland, spoken on a warm day in August 1942, directed to his deputy Otto Wächter, recently transferred to Lemberg from Krakow and now serving as the governor of District Galicia. Hans Frank's words exterminated my grandfather's family and hundreds of thousands of other families and human beings, Poles and Jews. And 3 years later, Frank was charged with crimes against humanity and genocide. And a year after that, 75 years ago from now, in fact, hanged in the courtyard of Nuremberg's Palace of Justice for crimes against humanity. If you could put the next slide up, Melissa. I learned too, extraordinarily, that the man who put crimes against humanity into international law actually came from the city of Lviv. He was a student at the university, and those who'd invited me were not aware of that fact. And then, amazingly, in preparing the lecture, I learned that the man who invented the word genocide, Raphael Lemkin, also passed through Lviv and astonishingly was also a student at the same law faculty. Again, those who invited me were not aware of that fact. And I learned of the work that Lauterpacht and Lemkin did. On the screen, you can see the inventions of their legal terms in their own handwriting. I learned that Lauterpacht and Lemkin actually prosecuted Hans Frank, respectively, for crimes against humanity and genocide. But at the moment that the trial opened, they were not aware that the man they were prosecuting was responsible for the deaths of their entire families. 6 years after that first visit, I published East-West Street on the origins of genocide and crimes against humanity. You can turn that slide off now. Thank you, Melissa. It's not about the life of one individual, but 4 individuals. And it seeks to understand how the particular circumstances of each of those 4 men contributed to the roads that they took. Apologies, there's a lot of sun in London today. Spring is coming as lockdown is easing. Contributed to the roads that each took and how the different roads they traveled changed the system of international law. That's my daily work and the daily work of so many of you in on this conference. As many of you know, East-West Street also touches on a rather personal theme, how the four interweaving lives influenced the path I've taken, directly or indirectly. And below the lives of Lauterpacht and Lemkin and Frank and my grandfather lurk some bigger questions that touch each of us. And they address central themes of identity, of human identity, which each of us has cause to think about from time to time. Who am I? How do I wish to be defined? Am I an individual, or am I more a member of one or more groups? And significantly for this conference, how do we wish the law to protect us as individuals or as members of a group? It was probably my work as a barrister rather than my writings that caused the invitation to be sent from Lviv. In the summer of '98, I'd been peripherally involved in the negotiations in Rome that led to the creation of the ICC, a body that would have jurisdiction over genocide and crimes against humanity, as well as two other crimes. The essential difference between the two concepts, of course, is on who is protected and why. If 10,000 people are killed, murdered, exterminated, the systematic killing will always be a crime against humanity. But will it be a genocide? That depends on the intentions of the killers and the ability to prove that intention. To establish the crime of genocide under international law, you have to show that the act of killing is motivated by a special intention, the intention to destroy a group in whole or in part. If a criminal prosecutor can't prove that a large number of people have been killed with that intent, then the crime of genocide is not established. And so you've got these two international crimes operating side by side and overlapping. Every genocide will also be a crime against humanity, but not every crime against humanity will be a genocide. A few weeks after the two crimes were inscribed into the statute of the court, Senator Pinochet was arrested in London on October the 16th, 98, amazingly on charges of genocide and crimes against humanity, laid against him by a Spanish prosecutor. The highest court in England, the House of Lords, ruled that even as a former president of Chile, he was not entitled to claim immunity from the English courts. That was a wholly novel, revolutionary judgment. And so in the years that followed, the gates of international justice slowly creaked open after about 5 decades of quiescence during the Cold War chill that followed Nuremberg. Cases landed on my desk: former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Congo, Libya, Afghanistan, Chechnya, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Sierra Leone, Guantanamo, Iraq, Palestine, Israel. They were always based on the new rules that came into being after 1945, that revolutionary moment in the making of modern international law, which began in Courtroom 600 of Nuremberg's Palace of Justice, when it was recognized for the first time that the rights of the sovereign over its people was not unlimited. That long and sad list of cases that reached me reflected the failure of good intentions aired in Courtroom 600. I became involved in too many cases that involved mass killings, either crimes against humanity, the killing of individuals on a large scale, or genocide, the destruction of groups, or sometimes both. The two distinct crimes, with their different emphases on the individual and the group, grew side by side, although over time, genocide seems to have emerged in the eyes of many as the crime of crimes, an unhappy hierarchy. David Luban has written importantly about that, one that leaves the unfortunate suggestion that the killing of a large number of people as individuals rather than as a group is somehow less terrible. Hans Frank's son, Nicholas, is a significant character in East-West Street. A journalist and a writer, he despises his father. The first time I met him, when I went to interview him in Hamburg, he said to me, "Philippe, you have to understand, I'm against the death penalty in all cases, except in the case of my criminal father." And it was he who introduced me to Horst Arthur Wächter, the son of his father Hans Frank's deputy, Otto Wächter, who was an Austrian, and like Hans Frank, also a lawyer, the one who became governor of Krakow and later of Galicia. Wächter, the father, was indicted for mass murder, more than 100,000 Poles and Jews. But unlike Frank, he was never caught. Wächter died in Rome in 1949 in mysterious and unexpected circumstances. You will like Horst, Nicholas says to me, but he is different from me. He loves his father. We could put the third slide up, please. Melissa, thank you. In the spring of 2012, I make the first of many visits to Horst, to the dilapidated 12th century castle in the village of Hagenburg, north of Vienna. You can see him here in his favorite room. Back then, when the photo was taken, he was in his early 70s. He was born in 1939. He's a genial and chatty man, often dressed in a pink shirt and Birkenstocks. We talk, we eat, we drink. He's genial, he's generous. He speaks of his parents' Nazi beliefs, of his love for his mother, Charlotte. She was a Nazi until the day she died, Horst's wife, Jacqueline, would whisper to me, and how he grew up with a childhood of plenty. I was a Nazi child, he says to me, with a smile. He was named in honor of the Horst Wessel song, and his godfather was Arthur Seyss-Inquart, who ran Austria after the Anschluss and later became governor of German-occupied Holland. He was in the famous trial at Nuremberg, and he was hanged shortly after Hans Frank. Horst keeps a photograph of his godfather next to his bed, which I find curious. I hardly knew my father, Horst will tell me, but it's my duty as a son to find the good in him. If we could take that image off. On that first visit, Horst shares albums filled with black and white photos from the 1930s and 40s, images of family holidays on lake or mountain interspersed with the occasional swastika. A picture of Hitler, a haunting photograph of a child in the Warsaw Ghetto. The scrapbook makes clear that the Wächter sat at the top Nazi table. And there's also an extensive collection of his parents' diaries and letters and Charlotte's reminiscences. But I'll only come to see these many years later. At the end of that first visit, I leave quite intrigued by Horst and his papers. I like him, as Nicholas said I would. A year passes. I write a profile of Horst for the Financial Times. He doesn't like it, severs relations, and then comes back to me. The article catalyzes a commission for a BBC documentary, My Nazi Legacy, which traces my relationship with Nicholas and Horst and takes us together to Lemberg. Horst doesn't like the film either and severs relations, then returns once more. But one scene in the film irritates him. It was filmed in Lviv in the archives, a moment where Nicholas wonders aloud whether Horst could be a new kind of Nazi. In fact, Nicholas later retracts that charge, and I disagree with it. Horst wants to counter the claim. I don't think of you as a Nazi, I say to him. And he asks me a question. Philippe, how can I prove that I'm not a Nazi? It's an interesting question, and as we all know, it's always difficult to prove a negative. I reflect on the matter, and then I come up with an idea. Why don't you not give all the materials to a museum so that scholars and others who are interested can review the totality of the material? An utterly unique collection, one that traces the life of a leading Nazi couple from the moment they met in 1929 until Otto's death 20 years later. Horst agrees, and he offers the material to a building that is close by Georgetown Law School, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. It is digitized and it's made public. And just a few weeks ago, as you can see on the next slide, it has been made available on the museum's website so that any of you can dip in and take a look at this extraordinary archive. Horst asks me if I'd like a set. Yes, I say, I'd love to have a set. And a few days later, a single USB stick drops through my letterbox. 13 gigabytes of digital images, nearly 10,000 pages of letters, postcards, diaries, photographs, news clippings, and official documents. You can see the style on the screen right now. The collection is indeed remarkable. It includes Charlotte's personal reminiscences, written for her son Horst and the couple's 5 other children, reminiscences grouped by time period, 1938 to 42, 42 to 45, and so on. There are also Turnbänder, sound recordings, 14 old cassette tapes digitized, which allow me to hear Charlotte's German cadence, methodical and rhythmic, high-pitched, anxious, and it seems to me, not warm. If you could put the next slide up, Melissa. You can see an example of this, and this material is not yet available on the Holocaust Museum website, the outer sleeve of one of those old cassette tapes that I and perhaps others on this call grew up with. In the hand of Charlotte Wächter, she has written Conversation with Melita Wiedemann. It's a 1977 tape recorded at the Four Seasons Hotel in Munich. And it's an amazing thing to listen to it. You hear the sound of glasses being clinked, toasts being offered, and views being expressed. A real personality, Charlotte says, of the British fascist Oswald Mosley. And then she adds, you know, I was a really enthusiastic Nazi. So was I, Frau Wiedemann replies. Still am. Great times, Charlotte adds. Hitler really was our savior. You can turn that slide off. Thank you, Melissa. The material allows me to see the private side of Governor Wächter's nefarious work in Krakow, Lemberg. What exactly did he do? Why did he travel to Rome? What caused him to die there at the relatively young age of 48? How much did Charlotte know, and what support did she provide in the crimes that he committed? And most interestingly to me, what was their relationship really like? The material is voluminous and mostly handwritten. It lingers for many weeks until one of my colleagues at UCL in London, the fine but late historian Lisa Jardine, intercedes. She recently delivered an inaugural lecture at UCL with the wonderful title, Temptation in the Archives. How do you assess archival material of a personal nature, is her question. What's the historical value of personal documents? By then, Lisa already has terminal cancer, but she summons a few of us to her apartment in the shadow of the British Museum. Bring a few documents, she says. She gravitates immediately towards the personal correspondence and the diaries, and she's struck by the sheer number of letters written in the last months of Otto's life while he was on the run, a hunted man. She asks me a question. Why would a husband and wife write to each other so often, at such length and detail, while he's on the run? I venture an answer. Because they loved each other? No, she says. There's a lot more there. They're sharing things they don't want others to see. The letters from the last years after the war, when Otto was on the run, are coded. There are no names, no precise places. Focus on the last year of Otto's life, Lisa suggests. Start there and look at the nature of the spouse. What was Charlotte's role? And that was what catalyzed another research project, one that lasted another 5 years, an exploration of what lay between the lines and behind the words. And I stumble into a world of escape and espionage, of double dealing and duplicity, of exhumations and reburials, traveling from the Vatican to Syria and then on to South America, into monasteries, over lakes, across mountains, until I reached the world of the Ratline, the Reich migratory route, as some have called it, the escape route used by some senior Nazis to make their way from Italy to Argentina and other places. What I will learn is barely imaginable. It's a story of love and lies and justice, of a couple fleeing from the prospect of discovery and arrest, of charge and trial, of sentencing and the noose, an escape from international criminal justice. At the heart of the story is a relationship, one that survived, Charlotte, the wife, believed, because our love was without any limits and even went beyond death. Charlotte is at once fascinating and repellent. Born into a family of steelmakers in the small Styrian town of Mürzeschlag, she was on her own account a difficult and rebellious child, intelligent, if not intellectual. She enrolled as a student at the Women's Academy and School for Free and Applied Art, and she develops a fine artistic eye, helped by renowned teachers like Joseph Hoffmann of the Wiener Werkstätte. A career blossoms. She designs fabrics, which are sold with great success in Germany and Britain. And she keeps a diary. You could put the next slide up, Melissa, thank you. She's a fine sportswoman, and in the spring of 1929, as her diary records, she travels to the local Schneeberg ski resort and shares a train compartment with a stranger, a striking young lawyer. Actually, a lawyer who has entered the University of Vienna Law School a few years earlier, 10 years earlier, on the same day as Hirsch Lauterpacht, who will invent the legal concept of crimes against humanity. My new baron was tall, slender, athletic, with delicate features, very beautiful hands, she records. He wore a diamond ring on the little finger of his right hand and had a noble appearance, one that any girl would notice. 6th of April, she writes in her diary, I fell in love with good-looking, cheerful Otto. They court for 3 years and then they marry, a result of her unexpected pregnancy. You can turn the slide off now. Thank you, Melissa. He starts to practice as a lawyer and becomes increasingly active and senior in the banned Austrian chapter of the Nazi Party. She supports and encourages his politics. In the summer of 34, Otto leads the unsuccessful coup attempt on the government of Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss. He flees to Berlin and joins the criminal division of the Sicherheitsdienst, or the SD, the intelligence service of the SS. He works in the same building as Adolf Eichmann and enters the orbit of Heinrich Himmler, who becomes his patron and his mentor. In 1936, Charlotte joins him in Berlin with Horst's 2 oldest siblings. She discovers, in fact, that he's having an affair with a younger woman, and to effect an unusual revenge, decides to name their 3rd child, a daughter, after the mistress. She will be called Trauter, she tells Otto. That should please you. In March 1938, Germany seizes Austria and they're able to return home. It's the Anschluss. Charlotte records her reaction. Every Nazi felt such joy about this miracle. She drives to Vienna to pave the way for her husband's return. There he was, in the doorway of my parents' flat in Vienna as a Brigadeführer in his black SS coat with white lapels and SS uniform, she recalls. In spite of the strain and the fatigue, he looked absolutely splendid. They make their way to the Hofburg Palace through crowds overcome with, as she writes, a spontaneous and heartfelt outburst of joy. Seyss-Inquart and his wife and a number of others came with the Führer, who slowly climbed the stairs of the Hofburg up to the balcony. The Führer was standing 1 meter in front of me. I could see and hear him well. They are truly top-table Nazis. At the bottom of those stairs, after the joy, she tells Otto he should accept Seyss's offer of a senior job in the new Nazi government rather than return to the life of a lawyer. That single decision will have dramatic consequences. It will change their lives as well as the lives of their children and grandchildren. Charlotte's diaries pass in silence on the substance of Otto's new position. This I will have to glean from the archives. And I learned that as a state secretary, it was his job to remove every single Jew and other political undesirable from public office, from the federal chancellery to the postal service. If you could put the next slide up, please, Melissa. He axed more than 16,000 individuals. And since we're in a university environment, let me mention that 2 of them were his own university professors at the law faculty at the University of Vienna. On the left, Professor Joseph Hupke. On the right, Professor Stefan Braslov. Professor Hupke was the dean of his law school who signed his graduation certificate. Wächter it was who removed them from their university positions in the summer of the 1938, stripped both of them of their pension rights, consigned them to penury, and arranged for their deportation to camps where they perished. You can turn the slide off. As Otto crossed lines, Charlotte offered unstinting support. She just loved the perks. the Mercedes, the cocktail parties, the concerts at Salzburg, the trips to Bayreuth in the presence of the Führer and Himmler. And she loved the new homes, freshly emptied and appropriated. In Vienna, they were given a large villa with its own park. Later, on Lake Zell, they acquired a small summer house, just 16 hectares, previously owned by the governor of Salzburg, who will spend the wartime years at Ravensbrück concentration camp. And then the war arrives in September 1939, and Otto's career is propelled to even greater heights and horrors. Seyss-Inquart recommends Otto for the position as governor of Krakow in Western Poland, and Hitler appoints him to the position of a territory newly occupied by Germany, working directly under Hans Frank. Charlotte is fully aware of what is going on, as he writes about in his letters going home. There's a lot going on here. Otto writes in December 1939, tomorrow I have to have another 50 Poles shot. The next slide, Melissa, is actually a video, and I hope the sound might work if you press the play button.
Oh, 17th of December, 1939. Dear Chumchen, many thanks for your lovely letter. There's a lot going on here. On the one hand, we've had some lovely things in the last few days. Chirac, General Arbeitsführer Polenz, RM Funk, and the Philharmonic. It was a great success, and so also a great success for me. Frank was very impressed. On the other hand, not such nice things. Sabotage, nasty business, car accidents. Ultimately, an attempt on the life of the Governor-General. Tomorrow I have to have another 50 Poles shot.
Those of you who are familiar with the Harry Potter audiobooks will recognize the voice of Stephen Fry. This act of killing was a first and notorious act. It was personally ordered by Adolf Hitler, 25 Poles to be executed for each German killed by partisans. And it was Otto who signed off on these acts. And it was he also who signed off on the acts against the city's Jews and Polish intellectuals. Otto ordered and oversaw the construction of the Krakow ghetto. I look for a hint of regret in Charlotte's papers. 8,677 pages, not a single sign. 3 years later, the Krakow job completed, Charlotte celebrates when Hitler appoints Otto to Lemberg to clean up District Galicia, recently occupied by Germany. Otto keeps her constantly abreast of developments. There was so much to do in Lemberg after you left, he writes to her in one letter. The harvest has been gathered. Polish workers have been sent to labor camps. Already 250,000 have been sent from the district, and the current large Jewish operations, the Judenaktionen, implemented. Lots of love forever, he signs off. What he's referring to is the final solution. Himmler visits, offers him a position in Vienna. If he doesn't want to stay, Otto decides to stay. I was almost embarrassed about how positively Himmler talks about me, Otto reports to Charlotte. On the other hand, manual labor is now proving to be difficult to find. As the Jews are being deported in increasing numbers, it's hard to get powder for the tennis courts. As the deportations and exterminations proceed, Charlotte spends time with the children on the Schmittenhohe outside Zell am See. Picnics in solitude, ponds, naked dips in the sun. She misses Otto. We stayed for 4 hours on the moss and in the blazing sun, overwhelmed by the sheer extent of nature. It's this disconnect between horror and beauty that is so troubling, but also so compelling to read. Occasionally, Charlotte's papers refer to a big political event, war, the occupation of France, difficulties on the Eastern Front, the onward march of the Red Army, and collapse. But life with Otto is often presented as an idyll. Just below the surface, there are some hints that things aren't perfect. In the midst of the tumult and the unmentioned mass murder, Mundane life continues. Meals have to be cooked, children fed, grandparents looked after. A husband's absence may be a matter of pride if he's visiting Herr Himmler, or irritation if he forgets a daughter's birthday. There's the matter, too, of love and sex. Otto's looks and power bring ample opportunities, causing Charlotte much unhappiness. He had many affairs. Beyond Treanor, she had several abortions, including at least one to get her own back on her husband. Carefully read, Charlotte's diaries reveal more. What you learn with any document is you have to read them over and over again. She works as a volunteer nurse at a hospital in Lviv, recording in an English that Otto cannot read or understand that she has lost her heart to a young soldier. And in the spring of 1942, as the final solution is being implemented, she falls in love with Otto's boss, Hans Frank. I send the relevant pages of her diaries to Frank's son, Nicholas, who responds mischievously. Sensational, he relates in an email. Perhaps Horst and I are brothers. The letters trace the bitter last months and weeks of war. One photograph shows them towards the end of the conflict. Perhaps you could put that up now, Melissa, the next slide. You can see here Otto and Charlotte with Horst and then Treanor. Horst is the little boy on the left. At the most acute moments, as the Red Army approaches Lemberg and the end nears, Charlotte and Otto find time extraordinarily to write to each other almost every day and to continue to hope. Ever the Anglophile, and she considers the English to be even more nationalist than the Germans, Charlotte has written in 1932, Charlotte allows herself to imagine a new ally in the struggle against the dreaded Soviets, the Bolsheviks. I hope that the English will be fed up and will unite with us, she writes to her husband. Ah, no, there's an impediment, she recalls. The Jews, always getting involved, always contaminating everything. If the slide could go off now. On the 9th of May, 1945, the war ends. Otto is indicted by the Americans and the Poles for mass murder, for crimes against humanity and genocide, and he disappears off the face of the earth. His name is in the papers. He's indicted, listed as a wanted war criminal with Seyss-Inquart, who is caught, put on trial at Nuremberg, convicted and executed. To survive, Otto has to rely now on Charlotte, and the power tables are turned. A new chapter opens. Evasion and escape requires new friends and allies in the Vatican and beyond. And Charlotte's papers provide extraordinary detail of Otto's escape, including the time he spent hiding in the Austrian mountains with a young companion, Burkhard Ratman, who was called Buko. All of this was new to me. In the first 5 years that we knew each other, I was interested in the war years. It was only later with the documents that I learned about the post-war years and this remarkable story. Drinking schnapps, seated around the fireplace in the upstairs living room of the Schloss, the one you've seen on the picture, Horst muses about Otto's time in the mountains, on the run, trying to avoid a trial in Nuremberg. The archive contains a handful of letters and a small number of photographs from those years. There are gaps, and I have many questions, not least about Buko. What did he do during the war? What was he like? Why did he help Otto? You want to know about Buko? Horst asks. I nod. Well, I can answer all of your questions and tell you everything about Buko, or we could telephone him. Pause for a moment. This is 2017. The words surprised me enormously. Buko was alive and well, aged 92, and living in Germany. Horst wanders into another room, dials a telephone number, a direct line to the past. He speaks in German for a few minutes, then returns. Buko will be pleased to receive us in a month's time at his home, and he does. But Buko imposes a single condition. I must ask no question about anything that he did before the 9th of May, 1945. Why? Because of international criminal justice. For the remainder of his life, he worried that the long arm of the law might yet, even in 2017, bring a dreaded tap on the shoulder for his role as a killer of partisans and villagers in Italy and Yugoslavia. If you could put the next slide up, please, Melissa. Horst and I spent a day with Bucco. You can see Horst on the left and Bucco in the middle. He talked seamlessly about the 3 years spent on the run with Otto, how they feared capture, moved frequently from one place to the next, high in the mountains, between huts where they were safe. They always avoided valleys. The Americans and the English were too lazy to go up into the mountains, he tells me. Did news reach them? I ask. Yes, of course, he says. Whenever Charlotta visited every 2 weeks, she brought newspapers. Otto wanted the sports pages and news of the Nuremberg trial. In this way, they could follow the proceedings from a distance and at a great height. They read of the outcome, the convictions, the sentences of death, the hangings of Otto's friends and colleagues, Hans Frank, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, and Kaltenbrunner. How did Otto react to the news of the hangings? I asked. Sanguine, Bucco says, even though he knew Frank and the others well. Vae victis, Bucco adds. It's a Latin adage offered with a slight shrug of the soldiers' shoulders. Bucco looks at us knowingly. Woe to the vanquished, to the victor, the spoils. The news of the hangings increased Otto's sense of anxiety. As we talked, my eye would occasionally wander to the shelves behind Bucco, which you can see in this photograph. And among the books, he'd placed various mementos. If you could put the next slide up, please, Melissa. After the formal interview was over, I went to have a look. What you'll see in the books, if you look very carefully, is a little black box which contained an iron cross and a swastika on the outside of the books. And then if you look at the little photograph very carefully in front of a copy of the Golden Treasury of German Fairy Tales, is a tiny round picture frame. I noticed it behind Bucco as we spoke, but from a distance I couldn't make out who it was. And now I can see a small black and white photograph of a man seated, pensive, with an armband, Adolf Hitler sitting on a bookshelf in January 2017. The good old days. You can take the slide off now. Thank you, Melissa. After Otto leaves Bucco in the summer of 48, he makes his way south, Salzburg, Innsbruck, and then by foot across the Dolomites into Italy. The correspondence with Charlotta provides details. The friends and lovers who provided refuge and the other forms of assistance and comfort on the way in Bolzano and elsewhere. A dramatic arrival in Rome, greeted by senior Vatican figures, including a very positive religious gentleman who has connections to the very top. From this correspondence, all of which is anonymized, we eventually work out who he met, who he hung out with, and what the Americans were up to in the Eternal City with their new friends and allies. How the new war, a Cold War, ensnared Otto, and what exactly the Americans knew about his whereabouts and when. The path to the Ratline comes into view, and it is a surprising and deeply troubling one for anyone who's interested in the subject of international criminal justice. Let us not forget about realpolitik, the real world. The facts are so troubling that I go and visit my neighbor, the writer of spy novels, John le Carré. He invites me to tea. I arrive with 6 small cakes, a handful of Otto's letters, and a few photographs. We sit in his living room as the sun streams in across papers laid out on a sofa and a low table. And then he surprises me. I was there in 1949, he says. I didn't know that. I was a young British soldier interrogating Nazis. For prosecution, I ask. No, he replies, we were recruiting them. It was bewildering, he continues. I had been brought up to hate Nazism and that stuff, and all of a sudden, I find that we've turned on a sixpence, and the great new enemy was to be the Soviet Union. It was all very perplexing. That was within 3 years of the end of the Nuremberg trial, and that offers a different sort of context for this conference. So why did I engage in a project like this? What is it about the Wächter family that caught my imagination? There aren't, of course, simple answers to these questions, but it seems to me clear that in my case, certainly, international justice is part of the picture. And what I've learned is that international justice is not only a formal story of courts, of tribunals, of rulings and judgments, of prosecutors and judges and witnesses and defendants. It's also a deeply personal set of stories. There is, of course, the connection to my own family in Vienna and Lemberg. Wächter was directly involved in the actions that contributed to the mistreatment and extermination of my grandfather's own family. And so I had my own desire to fill in the gaps and remove the silences. There is the implications for justice. Wächter died a painful and lonely death in the Vatican-run Santo Spirito Hospital. He was indicted, yes, but he was not convicted. He was never tried. And let's not forget that that fact created a space, one that is occupied by Horst. All the guilty ones have been judged, he once said to me. As far as he was concerned, the names of those responsible for the crimes had been fully documented. And since none of the lists of those tried and convicted included his father's name, he died an innocent man. Everything else, as Horst put it, is for the imagination. This is the untold story of Nuremberg and every other expression of formalized international criminal justice, one of those unintended consequences of more or less every legislative or judicial act. Inclusio unius est exclusio alterus. To include one is to exclude the other. This principle allowed Charlotte and their children to live the rest of their lives on the constructed and imagined reality that her husband, Otto Wächter, was a decent man. And that reality she passed on to her son. As you'll see in my book, The Ratline, however, the baton of innocence is not necessarily passed on to all the future generations, to all 23 grandchildren. There is, too, to explain my interest, the connection, of course, with my own work, the cases in particular. If you could put the next slide up, please, Melissa. I pondered these matters a year or so ago, sitting in the International Court of Justice in The Hague, when I was counsel to the Gambia, the case the Dean mentioned, in the matter involving the Rohingya community against Myanmar. As you can see from this photo, I sat just a few feet from Aung San Suu Kyi as she spoke as the agent of Myanmar, trying to persuade the judges that the Myanmar's military's actions against the Rohingya community might be excessive. Perhaps the odd war crime here and there, she grudgingly acknowledged, but most certainly not acts of genocide. None of the 17 judges was persuaded. The court, all 17 judges, joined in a unanimous decision on provisional measures, injunctive relief. How was it, I thought, as I was sitting there close to her, that she could not see the facts as others did? Some who know her believe the reason may lie in matters personal and of family, arising from her own complex relationship with her father, who was the architect of Burmese independence, the founder of the Tatmadaw, Myanmar's armed forces, assassinated just 6 months before the country gained independence. As she addressed the court, looking impeccable, with flowers in her hair, speaking so very fluently, I thought of Horst and Charlotte, and I thought of the Nuremberg trial, because, as I've already noted, all roads lead to Nuremberg. But for that summer of 45, we would not have been sitting there together in the courtroom. You can take the slide off, Melissa. The relationship between work and other life is porous. It's a two-way street. The law caused me to write as I did, dispassionate, restrained, addressed with facts and tiny details. But of course, my writing style and content are informed by my legal training. Could have the next photo, please. My interest in the Wächters. What does that come from? If you could put the slide up. Thank you, Melissa. I suppose in some way my interest is connected to the legal issues, to crimes against humanity and genocide, to the individuals, and of course, the group. And no group is more important than the one you see on this screen, the Wächters as a family. I opened the Ratline with a quote the great Spanish writer Javier Cercas, it's more important to understand the butcher than the victim. Why did he do what he did? And this perhaps is the biggest question that I and so many others are chasing, and so many have chased. How is it that a highly intelligent, highly educated man who entered law school, as I mentioned, on the same day as Hersch Lauterpacht, cultured, how could he become so embroiled in these acts of mass murder? These are not questions for the judges, of course, who are concerned only with what he did and did not do. But can we, who are so interested in the formalized delivery of criminal justice, also not ask what is surely the bigger question? Why? Warum? Pourquoi? If you could turn that slide off, please, Melissa. The answers to those questions do not reside in the judgments of courts. They live in the personal archives, in the letters, the diaries, the poems, the notes. In the Wächter correspondence, we find many clues. In his exchanges with his father, Joseph, a retired military general, we see how ideological and how purposeful was Otto, how he truly believed in the extermination of other human beings, because actually they weren't really human like we are. So why did he do what he did? This is a book about how lines get crossed, something I think that's very pertinent right now for many countries around the world, including the United States. And I'm thinking of the insurrection of the 6th of January. Once you cross a line, you open a door to other lines that might be crossed. And that toxic combination of ideology, of ambition, and of weakness comes together. But there is, I think, another conclusion. Otto Wächter's was not the banality of evil, to take Arendt's word. When you look at the personal correspondence and the private archive, you understand that he knew exactly what he was doing, that he embraced the horror, and the silence of the documents offers testament to his own awareness and commitment. And what of Charlotte? In many ways, she is for me the most fascinating of the characters in the book, perhaps the beating heart of the story, perhaps also of this family story of international criminality. It's plain from the personal documents that she knew everything, that she was completely complicit, that she egged on the man that she loved so much. And what of Horst, the next generation? He is in a state of denial on that which is in the archive and that which I have dug up. How do we understand the nature of his denial, which mirrors the denial of other individuals and of other groups, families, communities, even entire countries? Love and other things blind. Over time, they transform perceptions of reality and then reality itself. Like me, Horst was born into a family of silences. When the war ended, he, as Charlotte's favorite child, was protected, nourished, loved, and taught that his father was a fine and decent man. I'm so grateful that there are still people today who have positive things to say about my husband, his mother told Melita Wiedemann and Horst. I just don't want my children to believe that he's a war criminal who murdered hundreds of Jews. And Horst doesn't want to believe it either, even if he knows deep inside that the facts point in another direction. Together, he and I have stood before a site of mass murder near Lviv, and there the pain on his face was plain. He doesn't deny what happened, or his father's connection to the horrors, or his mother's support of them. He's not a racist or an anti-Semite. He just wants to characterize the facts differently, as Charlotte did. And he's able to do so in part precisely because his father was never tried and convicted, not by any court, not national, not international. And that space is one that he can excavate. It is a way of being able to live. It's a means of survival. Remember that letter that Otto wrote to Charlotte. I have to have 50 Poles shot. What is Horst's interpretation? He said to me at one moment, you see, Philippe, it says, I have to have them shot, not I want to have them shot. You have no proof. That's what he would constantly tell me. And I wanted proof, and I found proof. It took a long time, but I found it eventually in an archive in Warsaw. If you could put the next photograph up, please, Melissa. I put them in the book right at the end. You see here a group of 25 young men and boys in the snow waiting to be shot. This is part of that group of 50 Poles. Otto Wächter overseeing the execution. An absolutely dreadful image. And if you go now to the second image, the next slide, please, you see after the execution, the man in the shiny black SS coat, long leather, is Otto Wächter, having overseen the act of killing. Slide off, please, Melissa. I can't share Horst's characterization of the facts, but curiously, I still feel a degree of affection for him. And I respect his open spirit, his willingness to engage in my project and to respond to the suggestions that I make, including the return of the looted objects that his mother passed on to him. I feel too a certain anxiety for the price he has paid for sharing these personal papers with me, for making them public, which has had the effect of cutting him off from much of the rest of his family. If I'm able to be generous to him, he who protects the reputation of the father who was so deeply involved in the killing of my grandfather's family, it's because I retain a memory of a scene early in the film, My Nazi Legacy, April 1945, Horst's 6th birthday, when he weeps as he recalls that moment. But consequences of these events many years ago continue across generations. We all know this, all of us who work in the field of international criminal justice. I opened East-West Street with a quote from two Hungarian psychoanalysts, Nicholas Abraham and Maria Torok, from their book Notes on the Phantom, concerned with the effects on the descendants of injury or catastrophe that is felt by the parents or grandparents. The last words in the Ratline book are spoken by Magdalena, the granddaughter, one of 23, of Otto and Charlotta, and the only child of Horst. My grandfather was a mass murderer, she writes. Horst disinherited her because of these 6 words. Horst and I are bonded by a sense of dislocation and to events in time and place. Our points of departure have been very different. We are opposite sides of a shared story, but our paths crossed and somehow we arrived as a sort of endpoint. It's been a curious waltz, a constant movement, a double act in which each seeks to lead and persuade the other. And what emerges are secrets, family secrets, and questions of lies, justice, and love. What they mean and what memory is and does is another matter. And what we take from them as we design and redesign and continue to think about the delivery of international criminal justice is, I think, of singular importance. Yes, all roads lead to Nuremberg, but Nuremberg is not the end of the story. It unveiled new crimes, not least crimes against humanity and genocide, but these have given rise to their own issues and dislocations. Raphael Lemkin's friend Leopold Kohr wrote that the crime of genocide will end up giving rise to the very conditions it seeks to ameliorate, and I do not disagree with that. David Luban has evoked related concerns in his articles, including the one entitled Calling Genocide by its rightful name, calling for a redefinition of genocide, something I have joined him in trying to do. Over the course of today's conference, you're going to touch on many of the necessary issues that we, all of us, face in different ways. No doubt Beth Van Schaak will address some of the challenges, drawing upon her new book, Imagining Justice for Syria. And Tom Andrews will no doubt look at the implications of the coup in Myanmar for the direction of the Rohingya case. I have to say, having sat in close proximity to her, the idea that Aung San Suu Kyi is somehow the future of democracy in Myanmar does not sit easily with me. I'm aware too that Margaret de Guzman is a plaintiff in the ICC sanctions case advised by my good friend Andrew Lowenstein at Foley Hoag, which hopefully will now take a different turn in light of the Biden administration's welcome decision to revoke President Trump's executive order authorizing sanctions on top officials at the ICC. None of these things would have happened but for Nuremberg. And in that sense, yes, all roads lead to Nuremberg, which gave rise to a new, hopeful sense of the ideal of justice and its possibility. But let us not be starry-eyed. Justice can never only be about courts and hearings and pleadings and judgments. Justice writ large is about so very much more, including how families deal or not with these traumatic events. If my journey to the heart of Nuremberg through East-West Street and the Ratline have taught me anything, it is that individual stories really matter. Lauterpacht, Lemkin, Jackson, Donadieu, Frank, the Wächters, and of course, the stories of the victims. Thank you so very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Philippe, for that wonderful address. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Melissa Stewart. I am the Dash-Muse Teaching Fellow here at Human Rights Institute and also an adjunct professor of law. I've been coordinating the Dash conference today, and as you can see, the way that Philippe ties all of these themes together, touching on the work of some of our other panelists, is one of the reasons that we asked him to join us here today. Of course, if we were in person, we would be so thrilled to have Philippe join us after the conference for a book signing. But since we're not in person, I'm going to paste a note into the chat with a link where you can purchase his books through the Georgetown Law Bookstore, East-West Street, and the Ratline. So in the next, we have about 25 minutes left to have a conversation together. I have a few questions that I want to ask, but I also want to invite the audience to submit their questions using the question and answer feature that's on the bottom of your toolbar on your screen. But really, just to start off this discussion, I thought I would start with your reference to Hannah Arendt and her idea of the banality of evil, and your disagreement that this is really anything to do with the banality of evil, that really the acts that you describe in these books are evil acts that are committed knowingly. But as you demonstrate in your writing, the lives of some of these perpetrators of some of the most horrendous crime are anything but banal. You describe with intimate detail the moments of humanity, most notorious Nazi criminals, that Hans Frank was actually quite educated and cultured, and that the relationship between Otto and Charlotte Wächter was in many ways a tremendous love story. And one of the things that struck me in reading your book, I noticed this quote from Charlotte that she had recorded for her children, where she said that everyone has the light and dark sides, the sun in their heart and the deepest and grisliest darkness. And we should only see the good things in everyone. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about sort of the implications for all of us when we think about seeking accountability for some of the most atrocious crimes, when we're trying to also recognize the humanity in each other.
Oh. I mean, it's a wonderful question, Melissa, and it would require a very lengthy answer, so I'm going to give a truncated version. I studied law in a classical way at a good English university. I had wonderful teachers, and we looked at international law and international criminal justice as it was in the early 1980s, very different creature from today. And we looked at it as a very formal thing. And I think that was the way I learned about it. That was the way I started to practice it. That was the way I taught it until I began to have doors opened to other ways of touching on these issues. For example, a lot of people write to me and say, why don't you say that Frank and Wächter were monsters? You never say that. And it's because I don't think they were monsters. They did monstrous things. But the private correspondence and materials demonstrates clearly that they were also capable of humanity and decency and love. And that's the complexity of the issue. I think we have to go beyond the surface and look underneath. So the banality of evil, which is a wonderful expression, was coined by Hannah Arendt as she watched the unfolding of the trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961 in Jerusalem. And she records it in her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. And she describes an account of acts taken by a man which were almost adopted without thought. In other words, that he was some sort of relatively low-grade individual who mindlessly proceeded in a particular direction. Then a few years ago, I read a remarkable book by a German psychologist called Bettina Stragneth, who she had found in Argentina the material that Eichmann left behind, the personal correspondence, the diaries and other things. And she discovered a completely different kind of man, a man who was absolutely singularly committed to the acts he was doing. The problem with the banality of evil is that it suggests that this is thoughtless, it's done as a matter of higher orders or other things. And she absolutely demonstrates that was not what Eichmann was up to. He was a true believer and participant. And that is of singular importance, because as we think about international criminal justice, we ask the question, what is its purpose? Partly it's telling stories, partly it's prevention, or partly it's punishment, and partly it's prevention. This hope that by educational means, by fear means, it will deter these horrendous acts. And I think to understand the nature of the perpetrators helps us to think about the nature of the international criminal justice system. You know, I've always thought international courts were a good thing. But until I met Horst Wächter, I'd never really thought of the unintended consequences of what it means to prosecute 24 people and leave 240,000 unprosecuted. And it's the 240,000 at the end of the day who matter. You know, the stories that I get through letters from people literally every day writing that their grandfather was like Otto Wächter or Hans Frank, and no one would ever talk about these things. I suppose what I'm saying is, let's focus on the individuals. Let's understand what truly motivated them, which is not what courts do, actually, the point that I make in the lecture. But let us also not be starry-eyed. Creating an ICTY or an ICTR or an ICC alone is not going to address the fundamentals. We have to go beyond that. And as scholars and lawyers, we have to go beyond that. And as students, we have to go beyond that. That's the simple point that I'm making.
So you talk a lot about going beyond the surface into these deeply personal stories. And of course, the story you told in East West Street was a beautiful narrative, not only on the conceptions of crimes against humanity and genocide as viewed through the lives of Hersch Lauterpacht and Raphael Lemkin, but it was also a deeply personal story to you. And one of the things that I think we're actually doing a better job of as educators with our students is to try to educate them, to teach them about the whole person. And when you're working as human rights lawyers, often the gravity of the work that you're doing can really weigh on you. And one of the things that I think was striking to me, not just in reading the book, but also in viewing the documentary, you know, there was this moment where you're in the field with Hersch, and you have almost this, or Horst, excuse me, have this almost, it seems like a private moment, but then you switch back to the role of author, investigator, you know, really focusing on how he's thinking of this. But I'm wondering how this process of writing has impacted you personally, and how you deal with your role as a human rights lawyer and advocate, you know, you've met with some of the victims of the most atrocious crimes around the world, and how you sort of process this personally.
I met with some of the victims. I've also met with some of the perpetrators. So it does steel you. Well, I mean, I don't think I could have written this book 30 years ago. I mean, I think it's partly through being in the classroom, something you'll understand, Melissa, and others on this call will understand. Your role as a teacher, as a researcher, is to try to step back slightly from the material. It's never possible to do that entirely. And there are a couple of moments in my interactions with Horst where I lose my cool. I'm not proud of those moments, but it was impossible not to get incandescent with fury about his denial. But for the most part, in my demeanor with him, but also in the way that I write. I don't wear my passion on my sleeve. I thought that it was very important for the reader not to have imposed on her or him or them my emotional responses, that my job was to lay out the material and leave it to the reader to form their own view. And I've got to say, I've thought about this a lot, that this is, I think, very much influenced by the style of advocacy in international courts. Is you learn pretty quickly that telling judges what to do is not a good thing. It's not useful. You never say, oh, I think you should do this, or I think you should find that, or you must do this, or you must find that. And I've come to learn that the role of the advocate is to lay out the material in a way that will hopefully lead the judges by their own mental, intellectual, ideological processes to a particular conclusion, hopefully one that's consistent with what you want. And that is about keeping a certain distance. But also in writing both of these books, early on, I was very conscious of the fact that there are a lot of things that are already written about these events, which are very personal and very heartfelt. I didn't think I could actually add anything to that. What I wanted to do was meld the personal with the intellectual and the political. I know how courts function. I don't know much, but one of the things I know is how courts function. And I wanted to get inside the behind-the-scenes story of Nuremberg. You know, when I act before an international court, I've done a lot of homework on each of the 15 judges at the ICJ. We spend hours and hours and hours working out, reading what they've written, reading their judgments, reading their articles, reading their personal backgrounds to try to understand what will nudge them in a particular direction or what will irritate them. And I just applied that to the panel that sat in Nuremberg. Of course, I didn't know them. I didn't meet them. I met one guy who was an assistant to one of the judges, which was extraordinary to discover, to speak to him. And he's become a good friend, 95-year-old Yves Begbeder in France. But it just caused me to realize that the way I was taught about Nuremberg was different from what actually happened at Nuremberg. And you find it in the tiniest of details. You know, in the American Judge Biddle's personal notes, which are in the archive at Syracuse University, there's an extraordinary little note where Biddle writes of the French judge, Henri Donnet de Vabre. He was curiously tender in his attitude to Hans Frank. And so that intrigued me. What's that about? And of course, what I ended up uncovering was that 10 years earlier, remarkably, Donnet de Vabre had been invited to Berlin to give a lecture, like I've been invited to give this lecture, and he chooses as his topic the idea of creating an international criminal court. But this is ahead of its time in 1935. And he's invited by Hans Frank, who gives a response and says, that's a totally hopeless idea. It's never going to happen. What a load of rubbish. And then 10 years later, unbelievably, on the 20th of November, 1945, Frank is in the dock, and through the judge's entrance steps Donnet de Vabre. I mean, you couldn't invent it. But I also think it's impossible for a man who has had dinner with another man to sentence that other man to death. And Donadieu was the only judge who didn't sentence Hans Frank to death. And the personal stuff counts. I think it counts a lot. And for the students who are in on this conversation, don't ever forget that. Don't ever forget that. No one ever taught me that, and I came late to learn it and understand what it meant.
That's so interesting. And that's one of the things that you do so well with your writing, is to really make these connections. But I want to talk a little bit about one of the things you mentioned in your answers, keeping distance as a way of a sort of protective mechanism. But I want to flip it around and think about keeping distance as a way that sort of hinders our ability to truly look at what needs to be done. So for international human rights lawyers, so often our instinct is to look externally. You know, it's in the name, it's international, so we must look elsewhere. The human rights violations occur elsewhere. Accountability needs to take place elsewhere. But one consequence of this is the challenge that we have to really look internally. And you've spoken about this for your own country with Britain's inability to confront its own history with respect to slavery or colonialism, you know, as persists today, and its refusal to recognize the sovereignty of Mauritius over the Chagos Archipelago, or what happened in Ireland, which is particularly notable today as we're gathering in honor of Samuel Dash, who wrote a book called Justice Denied, A Challenge to Lord Widgery's Report on Bloody Sunday. But I thought it's also reflected on the more intimate and personal level when you're writing about Horst Vector. He really wants to believe the good in his father. And we want to believe the good in ourselves. We want to believe in the good in our family, with the people that we've had dinner with. It's impossible to sentence them to death. We want to believe the good in our nation. In the United States, we have such a hard time confronting our own challenges. So I wondered if you could sort of talk a little bit more about that and how we can do more as international human rights lawyers to hold ourselves accountable and our own nation accountable.
I mean, I certainly don't hold myself out as a paragon of virtue. I mean, we all know, we all have secrets. We all know that there are things we don't want to confront, things we've done or things we've thought or things we've said. Everyone has that. The challenge for a community is, how do you deal with a difficult past? And the United States, well, Britain and the United States, I think both have challenges there right now, and they are hardly well positioned to go around the world lecturing others on what they should and should not be doing. But I wrote about this. I wrote a piece a few weeks ago in the New Yorker magazine, prompted by the amazing video by Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger that he issued a few days after the insurrection of the 6th of January. It was really an amazing, it's a 7-minute video. It's really worth watching. It's fascinating. So he basically says, look, fellow Americans, I'm Austrian. I know all about these things. I know what this leads to. If you don't stop this now, you're in real trouble. And then he goes on to say, and I know about this because of my own past. My dad would come home and shout at my mother and beat us boys. And then he says, and I've thought about why he did that and why all the dads in our neighborhood did that, because of the shrapnel in their bodies and the things they saw and did. But the single most interesting thing about that statement, which I thought was amazingly courageous and powerful and basically terrific, was what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, my father was a Nazi. And I got in touch with various friends in Austria, and they said, oh, no Austrian can say my father was a Nazi or my grandfather was a Nazi. It's just like we just can't say it. Just like, no Brit can say my father was a slave owner, and it's pretty tough for most Americans also. And so I reached out to him in his office. We had a really interesting exchange that I wrote about in the New Yorker. And I understood that he could go so far, but somehow could not go any further. I mean, Britain, and the slave trade, Britain's story is shocking. Britain paid compensation for the slave trade, but who did they pay the compensation to? They paid the compensation to the slave owners for their foregone property opportunities. I mean, it's just unbelievable. You could not invent it. And there has never been an apology. There has never been an act of reparation, even in the broadest possible sense. And it continues to haunt, as it continues to haunt in the United States. And I suppose the lesson for this conversation about mass atrocity and justice is it does require, and courts are part of this, but they are not the solution on their own, a process of telling stories honestly about what happened. And I do think courts have a big role in doing that, but they can't do it on their own. They can catalyze things, but they cannot open up families and force families to confront the secrets of what grandfather did or did not do 60 years ago. And those secrets continue to haunt. And they haunt entire communities. And I think they haunt entire countries. And it's in that context now that I engage with international criminal justice, on questions of like, where should Saif Gaddafi be tried? Is it better that he's tried in The Hague at the ICC or better that he's tried in Libya? And I think you have to step back. And in thinking about these questions, they're complex questions. And I think the students in this conversation are entitled to step back and ask themselves those more complex questions. It's the beauty of international criminal law that it does force you to ask a lot of very difficult questions about our own communities and our own countries.
So speaking of difficult questions about our own communities, a question from the audience relates to the role of the American government in Europe after the war. The question is, why did the Americans not capture Vector? It appears they knew where he was, and it would have been so simple just to follow. Charlotta, did he provide information about the communists? And they were also left wondering why it seems important to you to persuade Horst about his father.
Well, I suppose, in relation to the question why they didn't prosecute him, the cleanest and neatest answer, and the one that I believe to be the case, is the one John le Carre gave me. They wanted his Rolodex. He knew who was who in Rome. He knew who the anti-communists were. He knew who in the Vatican could be relied upon. He knew who the reliable fascists were. And we wanted him on our side. And the Brits and the Americans and the Australians, turned a blind eye. We now know, as you've read in the Ratline, that within half a day of Vector arriving in Rome, absolutely terrified that the Americans would find him and send him for trial, the Americans knew exactly that he had arrived, what his false ID was, Alfredo Reinhardt, where he was living, and who was protecting him. They knew everything. And the only reasonable supposition was that they intended to use the material that he had in his files and in his head. And that's pretty shocking, because this is a guy who murdered more than 500,000 people. And that's the realpolitik of international criminal justice, which I think still applies today. Go onto the website of the International Criminal Court. Look at the indictees. Every single person who's been indicted is Black. And let me share with you something that I think is pretty obvious. Blacks don't have a monopoly on international criminality. Where are the people who tortured or authorized torture in Iraq and in Afghanistan, over which that court has jurisdiction? So that sort of lopsided sense of justice, which started with Nuremberg and of course predates Nuremberg, continues today. And I think we have to call a spade a spade. It's very, very problematic. It raises fundamental questions about the legitimacy of the order that's been created. And you see it in some of the judgments. Certainly of the ICTY, we are aware of judgments that are, shall we say, a little bit odd, in which the court seemed to have bypassed evidence that appears to have been pretty compelling. It seems now pretty clear that the ICTY wanted to dispense justice in a fairly even-handed way between the three communities. And that will cause difficulties going down the line. What we learn, is that the delivery of international criminal justice is inherently imbued with a sharp political element. And that started in 1945, who they decided to indict, who they decided not to indict, and so on and so forth. And so, again, I think we must not be starry-eyed. I'd say I was shocked. I was not looking for this story about Vector, but when I discovered what is now, I now know to be called Project Los Angeles, in which the US Army's Counterintelligence Corps created a 9-man anti-Soviet network. 3 Italian fascists, 4 senior Nazi SS officers, and 2 high-ranking Vatican officials. I was stunned, but it's all in black and white. And it's a shocker. It's a real shocker. And I'm sure it goes on in exactly the same way right now in relation to the delivery of international criminal justice today. Let us not be starry-eyed.
I think that's right. We only have a few minutes left, but I don't know if I could impose on your generosity to linger for maybe one more.
Sure, absolutely.
Question or two, and I'll take moderator's privilege to ask questions about a case that I'm very interested in, and I know a lot of members of our audience are interested in, and the representation of the Gambia versus Myanmar in front of the ICJ in the case brought pursuant to the Genocide Convention. I have so many questions that I could ask, but I think I'll keep it to, I think we've shifted our focus so much from the atrocities that have happened against the Rohingya to the recent events of the military coup. And I'm wondering what impact you think this is going to have on the case. The agent from Myanmar was Aung San Suu Kyi. She's currently detained and charged with violating state secrets, among other crimes, faces prison terms up to 14 years or more. So I'm wondering if you think that how the military will interact with this case, if at all, if they will comply with their obligations of reporting, if they will come to The Hague and further pursue this case. And then the second question that I have relates more to the Rohingya. You've talked a lot about your skepticism of the use of genocide as, it can have sort of a negative impact, that it can sort of further integrate these divisions between people. But one of the things that I think that was so important to the Rohingya, who've been denied citizenship for decades, been denied their very existence, was the recognition that they were a protected group within the meaning of Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. And the value of that they, exist as a group is inherently value in and of itself. So I'm wondering if you could talk about the tension between your view and that.
Yeah. Let me deal with the second part first, because it's such a central question. I do share the concern of Leopold Kohr that the invention of the concept of genocide, with its focus on the protection of the group, has had the unintended consequence of reinforcing the sense of group identity and reinforcing sentiments of intergroup hatred. And I've seen that for myself in cases that I've been involved in on genocide. On the other hand, the fact is each of us is a member of a group, and we have feelings of kinship and empathy with several groups of which we are a member. So it is a psychological and social and perhaps other, even biological reality perhaps. How does the law engage with that? I was involved a couple of years back with a wonderful man in Germany, a Turkish, German, Kurdish, Yazidi psychologist called Jan Kizilhan. I wrote an article about him in the Financial Times, who had created an incredible project. He set up a project to bring, in fact, 1,100 young Yazidi women who had been abducted by ISIS and horribly mistreated. Raped on a scale that just, I met a number of them. I still simply cannot comprehend what happened to them. It is so painful and so awful. And he wanted help from an international lawyer. And he somehow found me, and we got to know each other, and we worked closely together. And he said, I want you to help me articulate what has happened to this community as a genocide. I said, why a genocide rather than a crime against humanity? He said, because genocide is the only crime, it's exactly as you've put it, Melissa, which allows a community to believe that it is legitimate for it to exist as a group. And that is part of the process of recovery for people who have been through such terrible treatment. Psychologists will tell you that part of that process is understanding that what happened to you was wrong and that you're being singled out for being a member of a group is wrong, and that you need to understand that your group is recognized and respected, and genocide is the only international crime that allows that to happen. And members of the Rohingya community that I have met have expressed exactly the same view. I was with some of them in the Peace Palace in The Hague who came. The Dutch government very generously and wonderfully flew over a number of people from Cox's Bazar to be in the courtroom. And you cannot imagine how significant it was for them, and then communicated to other members of their community, to be in a courtroom with Aung San Suu Kyi having to answer for what had happened. So I'm truly conflicted about the genocide term. I would redefine it. I'd bring down the appalling burden of having to prove the intention to destroy a group in whole or in part is a numbers game. That is extremely problematic. But I understand Lemkin's rationale, whilst at the same time fearing that it has had this unintended consequence. Remind me of your first part of the question.
The question was, what, in short, how will the military coup impact?
Oh, yes. Well, yeah, I mean, God, who knows? I mean, who knows? Your guess is as good as mine. I mean, you know, Aung San Suu Kyi was the agent. She plainly cannot be agent anymore. Will they participate? And what about the lawyers? You know, I think Myanmar deserves credit for turning up at the hearings. I mean, I didn't like the defense, but at least they were there and sought to defend them, and they retained serious counsel. And that's part of the delivery of justice, that good lawyers take their cases. I would never criticize anyone for taking the case of Myanmar. That's part of our social function. I've taken on cases that, you know, I may or may not agree with. And one of the problems of Nuremberg, something that really bothers me, it's the only time in the history of the English bar, of which I am a member, the English bar adopted a ruling that no English barrister could act in the defense of a German on trial at Nuremberg. I think that's absolutely shocking, but it happened. So I wonder what will happen. Who knows? Let us wait and see. They'll have a new report to submit very soon. Let us see whether they submit a new report. The provisional measures order of the International Court went very far, concentrated by the fact that the terrible killings at Srebrenica followed 2 years after the ICJ's provisional measures order in 1993. So the Gambia argued to the court, you've got to have a regular reporting requirement, keeping hold of the case as it proceeds, and the court did that. So the court remains seized of the matter, even as the jurisdictional objections that Myanmar has put in are pleaded. So we will have to wait and see, but very, very difficult for everyone involved on that side of the case.
No, I think that's right. And you're correct. The reporting requirements are very important in this case. Hopefully they will comply. Any last words of advice do you have to our students who are embarking on their own legal careers, interested in international justice and human rights? What advice might you have for them?
It's a long game, and your generation is incredibly important in keeping the torch being carried. Do not get disillusioned or disheartened. These things go in ebbs and cycles, and international criminal justice is not about to disappear. There is a challenging time ahead, as we can see, with things going on around the world, including in our own countries. But it's a long game, and stay the course. There's going to be a lot to do, and a lot of good things to do, and a lot of interesting things to do, and a lot of important things to do.
Well, thank you so much for those final words for our students. We could not be more honored that you took the time to join us here today. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on your career, your book, your very important work. For those of you who are joining us for the conference, we're going to take a short break and come back at 2 o'clock for a panel on the ICC. But thank you again, Philippe. I wish we were in a room full of people giving you enormous applause, but we're so grateful that you joined us here today.
We'll all be back together. Thank you so much. Thank you, Georgetown Law. Thank you, Sam Dash Conferences, the Human Rights Institute, and be well in these very difficult times, but they will get better.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.